Hi, everybody. For our civil liberties project, we chose racial discrimination and segregation. Nicole Raine and Nicholas Hudson. I think that whenever we were going through the topics, this was kind of one of those topics that, while all of them are very relevant today, I think that this one, in the climate that we're in, was extremely relevant, which I think we both found crazy that something that we feel so distant from is still going around today. So if we kind of just look at the segregation part of it in the United States, that was separating people based on color, which means separating their housing, their separate educations, everybody, separate services and accommodations. I mean, at during like the 18th and 19th century, whenever we had segregation, this was like where there was this belief that black and white people, there was just no way for them to coexist with each other. It was something that was incapable of happening. And as we were reading, I mean, like I think of segregation, I do think of schools and houses and not being able to go to the same hotels and things, but it was like separate cemeteries and separate jails, and like everything had to be separated. Okay, so if we kind of go back and we look at, so after the 13th Amendment, which was the liberation of slaves, then you kind of see where it was like, how are we going to kind of keep the black people into like a slave mentality? So after all of this, you had things like the Black Code, and it was established in around 1865, and it was what was the laws for the blacks, and it was mostly in the South, of course, and it was the laws that dictated kind of their black people's lives, which it's kind of not funny, but it's weird that like after slavery had ended, they were still slaves. They still had somebody telling them where they could live, where they could work. They were definitely not free. Um, these codes also made it where black people were still made available for really, really cheap labor, even after slavery had ended. Okay, so as we transition from like the black codes, then there's um one. I didn't really know a lot about the black codes, but I think Jim Crow laws were something that um I kind of knew a pretty good amount about. But these laws were, this is around the time that segregation became almost like an official policy in the for Southern laws, and this was the Jim Crow laws were. Um, I mean, this was, I mean, named after a derogatory term for black people, and this was a way to continue on segregation. I mean, it went from, as I mentioned before, schools, houses, parks, pools, cemeteries, jails, everything needed to be um, separated. I mean, even the waiting area for doctors or asylums were completely separated. Um, it was, as we were doing some research, I mean, even in states like Oklahoma, there was a separate public phone booth. Like, you couldn't share the same phone booth, and colleges were kind of separated, and that's kind of where you saw HBCUs, which is historically black colleges, start to kind of come up. And then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which was pretty much saying that segregation was constitutional, that separate but equal, which we kept hearing like, yeah, we all have the same rights, is what I got from this, but we need to do it separately. Again, as I mentioned before, it was this idea that we cannot coexist. We couldn't live in the same place. with black and white people. It just wasn't going to work. It was going to be hell. Some provisions that we saw were the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Before this act, um, there was where um, all men could vote, but that didn't mean black men included. And I think that even after there was some different type of laws that was put in there that made it kind of where black men were supposed to be able to vote, they still were not able to vote. And you saw things like a literacy test that would have them read the Constitution or have them read like outrageous things, knowing that there was no way that a group of people that had been suppressed so much in education, there was no way they would be able to read the Constitution or recite different laws and things. And there was even things that white people were not able to um, recite. And then you had the Selma to Montgomery March, which came from that video that we just saw, and that was considered Bloody Sunday. And in 1965, President Johnson, who signed the Voting Rights Act, kind of put into place so that black people, men and women, all people were able to vote. So one big Supreme Court ruling that we saw was Levin versus Virginia. I think that there was even like a movie made about this couple. It was a black and a white couple in Virginia who had got married. They might have been married maybe 4 to 5 weeks before they were arrested, because in Virginia it was actually illegal. There was this law that, I mean, like almost all states, I think maybe not all of them, maybe like nine, at least nine of them at one point had a law where you couldn't marry outside of your race. It was like where they didn't want inbreds. So this case, the plaintiffs in this case were Richard and Mildred Levin, and the Supreme Court kind of struck down the state laws banning interracial marriage, saying that it violated their 14th Amendment right. You can marry whoever you want to marry, or not marry whoever you want to marry. And this ruling also overturned the Levin's conviction. I think that this is kind of great, especially now we see so many interracial couples, and um, a lot of them wouldn't be able to be where they are today if it wasn't for um, this big case. An executive order that we saw that had to do with discrimination was Executive Order 9981. It kind of came off the back of the Executive Order 8802 that was put into place to make it where there was integration in the defense. Um, but this order that was signed by President Truman actually ended segregation in armed forces, and there was this President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity Armed Services Board that was put together, and this board kind of was there to kind of guide them into implementing this order. By October 1953, the Army integrated more than 90% of their black troops into its ranks. I think after going through all these different cases and looking at the history of the racial discrimination and segregation, we are kind of in a point where you realize that some of that is still going on today. You see a lot in schools where schools in predominantly white neighborhoods have better education than the ones in the black neighborhoods. You see discrimination for black women who, or black men who maybe not get jobs or not get opportunities based on the way that their hair looks, even though that's their natural hair. You see mass incarceration, and then you see instances where sentencing in different cases are drastically different depending on if the person's black or white. For instance, we have a picture there that has where this black lady was homeless and she was trying to get a job interview, and she left her kids in the car, and she was sent to jail and her kids taken away. And then you have Clouser, a white lady in Arizona who got high and drove 12 miles with 2-month-old and in the car actually on top of the car, and she was given probation. So I think that while we've definitely made strides in racial discrimination, we still have um, more to go to, and I think it's one of those things that it kind of happens within everybody. Like everyone would have to change their way of thinking um, in order for us to get to where I feel like we need to be.